time has finally come. The last game featuring Kazuma Kiryu as the protagonist of the Yakuza series in the West has finally arrived, and I am excited. This is my first time experiencing the Yakuza 2 story, and from what I've been hearing from other fans of the series, this is one of the best stories this franchise has to offer, so my expectations are definitely high. Also, this is the second entry into the series using the new and fancy Dragon engine, which brings to the table the changes that came about in Yakuza 6 The Song of Life. And if you recall correctly, I found that game quite refreshing. But then again, I had the unpopular opinion on that one, because almost everyone else hated it. Which I can understand because, change feels bad and all, especially if your first entry was Yakuza 0, which still had the older combat system. I'm not saying that if you didn't like the new systems you're wrong, nor do I think that the older combat system this series had was bad. In fact, it was one of the reasons I was attracted to these games in the first place, but hear me out for a moment. I've been playing Yakuza games for a while, and while I did like the incremental changes they implemented to the system after Yakuza 0, I felt it had peaked by then, and I was pretty much ready to move on from it. I didn't mind it as much in Yakuza Kiwami because I felt it was thematic for that entry to be the last one using the old battle systems, and while I am aware that the same could be said about Kiwami 2 as well, I also keep in mind the fact that the Yakuza team is also learning the ropes with the new engine, so I didn't mind the change as much. But combat changes are not the only thing that come from the fact that this game is using the Dragon engine. I also expect this game to look as good, if not a little bit better, than Yakuza 6, only because they had time between that game and this one. The same goes for what the audio department has in store for me in this game. Now, before we begin, I have to make a disclaimer here. The copy of this game I got was provided by Sega for review, and as such, you may want to take my opinions with a grain of salt for this one. But anyways, let's not waste more time and see if this game is the complete package in both gameplay and story, or if it'll fall short. Without further ado, these are my thoughts on Yakuza Kiwami 2. Our story begins a couple of years prior to Yakuza 0 in the early 80s. It's just another party night in one of the many dance clubs that populated Kamurocho back in the day. But not everything is as it seems though, because behind the doors of said club, something far more sinister is going on. In this scene we see a young detective, who we will later know as Jiro Kawara, witness what appears to be a confrontation between a Korean mafia and the premier assassin of the Dojima family, Kazuma Shintaro, who lays waste to everyone in the building with his guns. Thankfully for Kawara, he goes unnoticed and manages to go through the building that's now on fire, noticing a woman and a child. While the woman of Korean descent is distrustful of the law enforcer at the beginning, he assures them that he only wants to save them from the massacre, after which the woman agrees to receive his help. We then cut to Kamurocho on December 14th, 2006. It seems to be a regular night out on the district, but not so much for the underworld, as the current patriarch of the Kazama family and acting captain of the Tojo clan, Kashiwagi, is informed that the Omi alliance down in the Kansai region is getting restless and may plan to go on a full-scale war against the Tojo clan. Sadly, the impending war isn't the only problem, as it seems that an outside force, the same mafia that was thought to be wiped out 20 years prior, had some survivors, and seemed to be working behind the scenes with the Omi not only to see conflict erupt, but to take revenge for the people that was lost during that fateful night. At the same time, our protagonist Kazuma Kiryu has been living a regular life with Haruka, the girl he adopted after the events of the last game, and they plan to visit the graves of those who were lost during the Millennium Tower incident and the conflict for the 10 billion yen. After a little bit of recollection on Kiryu's part on the events of Yakuza Kiwami, the pair are visited by a somewhat familiar face, the fifth chairman of the Toyo clan, Yukio Terada, who wants to pay respects to the dead as well as have a little conversation with Kiryu about the current goings-on with the clan. This reunion doesn't last long though, because a little bit after Terada arrives, a couple of thugs from the Omi Alliance arrive at the scene as well, and start stirring up some trouble. And even though Kiryu fends them off, they still manage to take their main target, Chairman Terada. And so it falls onto Kiryu to find who can be a suitable replacement for the deceased chairman, while also uncovering the secrets of the massacre that occurred 20 years ago, as well as defend not only the clan, but the entire town of Kamurocho from the incoming war for the city. Of course, there is a more deeply involved story to tell, but for the sake of not ruining the experience for you guys, I'm going to hold back a bit on what goes down on the main story and let you experience it for yourselves. Mainly because I feel this particular entry into this series should be enjoyed with as minimal knowledge as possible. For my part, I must say I was pretty impressed. You see, in my years as a Yakuza series fan, I've always heard from other people how this is the definitive Yakuza story, how it was the entry that cemented the series into a great one, and how this is the defining point for Kiryu's character. And while I do not agree 100% with those assessments, I can see where the people saying that are coming from, and why do they hold this game story in such a high regard. The twists and turns this story makes are pretty good, so much that by the end I felt pretty emotional about the final confrontation between Kiryu and the main antagonist and rival to the Dragon of Dojima, Goda Ryuji. Which leads me to the characters. Starting with the Dragon of Kansai himself, well, at the beginning I wasn't that convinced by him, his no shits given attitude as well as his raw charisma made me at least sympathize with him, even if I was totally against his plans and motivations. As for Kiryu, I must say this was the most humanized I've ever seen him, outside of Yakuza 6 of course. I'm not saying that he was a cartoon character or something of the like before, but in this story I could certainly see how he grew from the experiences of the previous games. Not only that, but the supporting cast that surrounds the events in the story is pretty on point. I could go on and on about each and every one of them individually, but it would take me hours, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think any amount of analysis I could do would do them justice. All I can say is that, thanks to the surrounding cast, the main story really came alive for me. They are all pretty well constructed and felt so real to me that I can't but give compliments to the writers in this game for the amazing job they did to put the story together. It may not be my personal favorite story in the series, that award goes to Yakuza 4, but I can see that this is a pretty good one nonetheless, and I would dare say it is a pretty iconic adventure if nothing else. Now, this being a remake of Yakuza 2 and sort of a sequel slash epilogue for Yakuza 0 means that there is way more story content than just the main scenario, which comes in two major forms, the Cabaret Club GP and the Clan Creator, which come with their own separate and pretty fleshed out stories as well. The first one you'll cross paths with around chapter 4 of the main story is one of the two epilogues for Yakuza 0, the Cabaret Club GP, in which we catch up with Yuki, the former head hostess of Club Sunshine, and find out that she not only left the club behind, but now has opened her own, Sotenbori Forshine. And just like Sunshine back in the day, Forshine is struggling pretty bad, not helped by the fact that the hostess club world is now controlled by the Kansaki group, led by the eponymous Kansaki, who, for a reason we learn later down the road, looks down upon Forshine and Yuki. It is, of course, up to Kiryu, who, by the way, was pretty much roped into this despite his protests, to put the place back into shape to compete against the Kanseki group in the titular Cavalry Club Grand Prix, a competition that brings together all the clubs of Sotenbori to see which one is the best of the best. While most of the time there won't be that much of a story to talk about, mainly because this is a side activity that's more gameplay focused, there are some genuine good moments, at least to me. The main plot is full of that classic Yakuza goofiness of Kiryu getting into a situation and then making the best out of it. But at the same time, the characters are developed a little bit. I mean, not as fleshed out as the main scenario, but pretty decent regardless. Although, if there is anything that brings it down to me a bit, is how if you want to get to know some of the hostesses that become part of Forshine, you have to double the amount of grinding you have to do to get their individual conversations and eventually sub stories. But, on the other side of the spectrum, at least these personalized conversations with the hostesses are pretty good. Again, nothing deserving of a prize novel or anything, but they are pretty heartfelt and down to earth. I'll keep it a little bit short on this one, but mainly because, like with the main story, I'd rather have you experience it for yourself rather than me spoiling the fun. But I will say I did quite like it, especially what happens almost right at the end of the story, which is also a pretty neat send off to Yakuza 0 for sure. Moving into the next side storyline, sometime after Kiryu's little excursion to Sotenbori, you return to the busy streets of Kamurocho. More specifically, you visit the construction site of the ambitious Kamurocho Hills project, headed by our favorite crazy eye patch guy Majima and his Majima Construction Company. And of course, because this is a Yakuza game and nothing Kiryu related can go 5 minutes before falling apart at the seams, we soon learn that Majima's construction equipment is being attacked by thugs sent by none other than Masahiro Chono and Kenji Muto. And this is where I lost my shit. If you remember my Yakuza 6 video, I mentioned that one of the things that made me enjoy the clan creator story in that game was the inclusion of New Japan Pro Wrestling stars as characters, but I thought the deal was pretty much just valid for Yakuza 6. Now imagine my surprise when the great fucking Mura walks into the scene with Masa Chono in tow. I was, of course, hyped as fuck, and the hype only went up as more New Japan legends showed up, like Riki Shoshu or WWE Hall of Famer Tatsuji Fujinami. By the way, can we take a moment to appreciate how crazy it is that a Japanese pro wrestling legend that's also part of the WWE Hall of Fame showed up in a Yakuza game of all places? Like, I know the wrestling world is nuts, but never in my life I thought something like this would have happened. But I'm rambling a little bit too much here. Back to the story. As you might have guessed already, the goal here is to take, either by hook or by crook, the plans of Kamurocho Hill's construction, and it is up to Kiryu to prevent this from happening while also helping Majima construction grow. Like the clan creator story in Yakuza 6, this one was pretty serviceable, although I did have some issues with it. Mainly that you don't exactly fight the NJPW legends like you did with the 6 lunatics, and I would say that I could attribute that to the fact that they may not want to make them look bad, but they are bosses on the Colosseum, so what the fuck. Anyways, in general terms, again I would say the clan creator story is about as enjoyable as the one in Yakuza 6, which is not a bad thing, honestly. I mean, most Yakuza side stories are not Nobel Prize contenders, but they are pretty good diversions from when the story gets a little bit too harsh. Although, if I had to complain about something, I felt it was a little bit shorter than the last one. But then again, you can one-shot the entire story this time around instead of having to wait 3/4 into the game before being able to continue, so that balances out. Finally, before we end this section, let me get into one of my favorite aspects of this series, the sub-stories, which this time around are aplenty, just like in all Yakuza titles. Now, for me, this is the first time I've ever played Yakuza 2, and as such, I wasn't familiar with them, so I didn't know what to expect. But let me tell you, I wasn't disappointed. There were some that did feel a little bit shallow, like the ones whose only purpose is unlocking new hit moves, but the ones that are developed were pretty fun. There's your crazy ones like touring a Korean singer around Kamurocho, or that Yakuza family patriarch that has a serious king for infant play. And there is also some that are more serious, like having to crack down on a kidnapping ring or talking to the director of a series of Yakuza movies that had a massive change recently, and how changing things in a beloved series is okay sometimes, people. Dragon Engine Combat. Oh, sorry. Had a little bit of a cough there. That was weird. So yeah, everything in this front is as good as ever. The sub-stories, alongside the clan creator and cabaret club stories, serve their purpose as a balance to the drama that is the main story. Although I do recognize that for some people it might take them out of the experience, which is fine. And after all, at the end of the day, Yakuza Kiwami 2 is a pretty strong package in terms of storytelling. Oh yeah, also fuck that Mahjong sub-story to hell! Wait, I feel like I'm forgetting something. Something rather important that is also part of the story of Kiwami too. What could that be? That's right! The Majima Saga! So, a couple of ways into the game, a little message will let you know that you have unlocked the first chapter of the Majima Saga, a sort of secondary campaign that takes place before and leads into the events of Kiwami 2 that stars the Mad Dog of Shimano himself. It tells the story of how he finds himself out of the Tojo clan and as the leader of his own construction company. Now disregard almost everything that I just said because it is only 3 chapters long and the quote-unquote main plot is paper thin as fuck. The important thing here is that it is actually pretty much just an epilogue for Majima's story in Yakuza 0, even if it came 2 games later. And as with Kiryu's story, I won't go into details about the plot, but in this case it is because me saying anything other than that would just fall into heavy spoiler territory, and I wouldn't want to ruin that for you guys. Let me just say that the Majima saga is pretty good. It does help to provide some context not only on Majima's character, but also to the events of the main story, which is pretty appreciated. And it also gave me closure on some things about Majima's character, at least in this part of the Yakuza timeline, and gives him free range to move on to what would eventually be his character arc for the remainder of the series, which is pretty nice. Although the downside of being so centered on Majima's 80s adventures is that if you haven't finished Yakuza 0, most of the middle to end portions of the Majima saga will make little to no sense, so you better be up to date on your Yakuza lore for this one. I hope that in future entries into the Yakuza series are not going to have multiple playable characters like in 4 and 5, at least we get little side stories like this one for other characters. After all, this was a pretty neat and well executed idea in my opinion, and I can see it as a way to perhaps expand future stories by looking them through other characters' perspectives. But that's just wishful thinking for the future. For now, I will enjoy this for what it is, a pretty nice story starring one of the most beloved characters of this series, and I hope you do as well. Alright, if you already watched my Yakuza 6 The Song of Life video, then you probably already know how I feel about this game's looks. But if you don't have that frame of reference, don't worry, I'll give you a surmised version of my thoughts this time around, mainly because I don't want to repeat myself too much. The second biggest change that came with the Dragon Engine was an overhaul in visual fidelity and overall graphical quality. I mean, for the sake of comparison, just look at how the last entry into the old engine, Yakuza 0, looked. It definitely looked good, but when you compare it to the rendered cutscenes that the game had, there was a big difference in quality. Now let's look at Yakuza 6. Sure, the drop to 30 FPS was a bit jarring, and some of the particle effects, specifically the ones related to hit actions, look a bit janky. But if you take a moment to just look at the game, you can see that it is way more detailed than how it was back in the old engine. Hell, in-engine cutscenes and gameplay look almost one-to-one with the pre-rendered cutscenes, which is quite impressive. Yakuza Kiwami 2 is kind of in the same place. After all, the gap between both entries into the Dragon Engine wasn't that big, so I can forgive the fact that while this game still looks gorgeous, it wasn't that big of a jump graphically speaking. But, delving into specifics for a bit, let me talk about the 2 main locations that are part of the story, Kamurocho and Sotenbori. First, Kamurocho looks as beautiful as ever, from the streets so full of lights and life, to even the most dingy of alleyways. Everything pops out and manages to look outstanding. Then we have the returning Sotenbori, which looks amazing as well. While some of the landmarks and the overall layout are still there, there is a clear difference on how it looks at this point in time compared to how it looked back in the 80s, which I appreciate, not only because I like the passage of time, but because it appears that as the years went by, it became closer and closer, if not equal, to Kamurocho in terms of nightlife, if that makes sense. Both locations during any time of the day look colorful, but honestly I feel they are better appreciated if you explore them at night, just because it sets a pretty relaxing yet exciting mood that brings the experience together quite nicely. Props to Ryuga Gotoku Studio for hitting the nail on that regard. Now, as I always say, not everything is perfect, and I did run into some issues, mostly in terms of performance during my playtime. But again, I'm running this game on a base PS4 model, so that might have to do a lot with the issues I'm going to talk about next. The first and most prominent one is the texture popping that I run across with from time to time. For example, the one instance of this that I could trigger quite consistently was running on the alleyway behind the drugstore in Kamurocho, which would just pop into existence, confusing me every time. And I get it, sometimes this kind of stuff happens in games, but I feel this should have been fixed at least for the Kamurocho map, which not only didn't happen, but in fact got kinda worse compared to Yakuza 6. Added to this, there is also an issue that did exist in Yakuza 6, but I felt it wasn't as prominent there, which is frame rate drops and overall stutter. I swear there are even some pre-rendered cutscenes where the frame rate actually drops, which means that I'm either crazy or the Dragon Engine might be a little too much for a base PS4. Probably both, but yeah, despite my complaints, I still give props to this game for looking amazing and colorful while still using a realistic art style. A couple of Western developers could learn a little bit in that regard from this game in my opinion, although again, this game could do a little bit better on the optimization front. Other than that, the presentation in this game is impeccable, and I hope Ryuga Gotoku Studio keep the same level of consistency while also maybe addressing some of the issues that I mentioned. One can hope, right? Now let's talk about one of the aspects of this series that is always consistently good, and in the case of Yakuza Kiwami 2, this is no exception. I am of course talking about the audio. For starters, the music in this game is rock solid. Almost every single tune in the game manages to bring some reaction out of me, which is always a good thing, with my personal favorite track being the Sotenbori battle theme, which never fails to excite me every time it starts playing. Also, every single time music comes out in a cutscene, it helps to establish the mood of the scene almost perfectly, which I really appreciate, although I reckon that's what most music in video games should do, but then again I still like the work they did with this game. As for the karaoke selection, well, I mean I do love them, but I feel they did get a little bit lazy with the playlist this time around with only 2 new songs, while the rest of them are repeaters from Yakuza 6, 0 or Kiwami, which isn't a bad thing per se, but I was expecting a little bit more, I guess. I really don't have that much to say about the music. If you've played any game in this franchise, then you already know it is pretty legit. And if this is somehow your first entry, then the only thing you need to know is that this is Sega we're talking about, and their music department has always been pretty tight. I definitely recommend you go out of your way and listen to the soundtrack at least. I also feel the same way about the voice acting, to be honest. The performances are pretty on point from the characters that only appeared in this game, and the returning ones reprise their roles pretty nicely. And I think the biggest example of this is Kiryu himself. Sure, he always sounds like a stoic badass, but there is one particular instance of voice acting in this game that got me pretty hard, which is his line about how he feels guilty about surviving the events of the original game. There is just something subtle about Kiryu's voice that really transmits his emotions while at the same time retaining his regular stoicness, and I could notice this even if I didn't understand the language, which is a sign of a job well done in my opinion. In general, the audio aspect of this game is just as good as previous entries have been, which is always a good thing, although I get the feeling that maybe they could improve on some aspects, although I can't exactly tell you which ones they could be since I was pretty satisfied with the results. Also, I was kinda bummed by the fact that there wasn't as much voice work in this game as in Yakuza 6, but considering there wasn't as much voice acting in the original Yakuza 2 and it helps to reduce the budget, it makes it less bad in my opinion. Although I hope Shin Ryuga Gotoku at least has the same amount of voice acting as Yakuza 6, but other than that, the audio section gets a thumbs up. Alright, we've already reached that part of the meal where we pretty much know what it is about. And while most of it has been a repeat from Yakuza 6, it is still a pretty damn good plate of meat and potatoes in my opinion. So, let's see if Yakuza Kiwami 2 manages to make any blunders to ruin this meal, or if it's gonna be as good of a meal as the Song of Life. Welcome to the gameplay section. On the minigame side of things, you have most of the ones that were on Yakuza 6. You know, like darts, batting gauges, gambling parlors, etc. And they retain their gameplay from the last game as well. So, if you want some more in-depth descriptions, you can always refer to the Yakuza 6 video if you wanna know more about that. Now, there are some weird absences and minor changes to some minigames that returned from the last game, but aren't exactly a minigame that you can replay multiple times. I know it sounds weird, but follow me on this one. First, there's no actual Hostess Club locations this time around, or at least none that I could find. Instead, there is this kind of a stripped down version of it with the Platinum Hostesses of the Cabaret Club GP, which bummed me out a bit because while there is a form of first person conversation with cute girls, there's just so much stuff missing that I just don't enjoy it as much. For starters, you do have an affection bar that fills up when you answer correctly to the conversation, but sadly, other than the correct answer, there is no other way to fill it. Kinda like the Yakuza 0 version of this, which means that if you don't answer correctly every time, forget about getting a full affection bar. And also, you can't repeat these conversations, so it is better if you just straight up look up a guide to help you out. And because of how high the affection bar at the end of a conversation is affects how much experience your hostesses receive from it, there's straight up a downside for answering wrong, especially because there is only 4 answers per conversation and some of those are a little bit tricky. So again, just look up a guide for this one. Other than that, I guess it is serviceable as part of the Cabaret Club GP. But if I'm perfectly honest, I kinda wish there was a separate Hostess Club location to visit. Mainly because I did want to see if they addressed the issues I had with the Hostess minigame last time around. But I guess you can't have it all. Next, an addition that I found very strange but pretty fun to play around with overall is golf. Yep, just a straight up golf minigame. Although not full courses, just small put the ball on the hole challenges, but still golf nonetheless. It pretty much feels like most other golf games I've ever played. You set up the direction depending on where you want the shot to go, you have a power bar that determines the distance, and there is also a wind indicator that tells you in which direction the wind is blowing. So you have to be aware where you're aligning your shot because the wind might just take the ball in a totally different direction. What this ultimately brings is a series of challenges that will test your ability to take plenty of factors into account, like the direction of the wind, the distance of the shot, and later on they even put obstacles on your way, which, while I find frustrating, makes for a pretty good challenge overall. I definitely recommend you at least give it a try. For our next minigame, I have something that I really only played once, toilets. Not spelled like actual toilets, but Toylets, which is no joke, a pissing minigame. And while it is an interesting concept, it requires you to constantly use drinks to get fuel to even play it. Needless to say, I immediately forgot it even existed until I started writing for this video. I mean, it's not bad, but I could live without it. Moving into another minigame I played just once, we have the bouncer missions, which really don't have a storyline attached to them, or at least none that I could find. So I just did the introductory one and then forgot about it as well. They basically consist on a longer than average combat challenge where you move through a small map and fight enemies until all of them are defeated, but with the caveat that you can't use items, so you gotta pull it off in one go. In general, they are fun, but nothing to write home about. Then we have perhaps the weirdest addition to the minigames, the grab your photoshoots, which is basically the camgirl chat minigame from Yakuza 6, but with a different excuse as to why you're watching softcore porn on a video game. And if I'm honest, if I wanted to masturbate, I would rather go onto the internet and watch porn instead. Hell, even if I wanted to watch some gravure, there are better ways to go about it than this, so I don't see why this minigame should be here. Let's just move on. Now, I want to take a moment to complain about something that I didn't touch upon my Yakuza 6 video, mainly because I didn't have to engage with it, but I was forced to by a sub-story in this game. Fuck Mahjong. Of all the board and tabletop games I've ever played, Mahjong is just the most super convoluted mess of tiles and poker I've ever played. Like seriously, I was stuck for like 2 hours trying to do this sub-story where you have to win a couple of Mahjong games. And even after reading guides about how to play it, I was still super confused and only managed to win 2 or 3 times tops, even without knowing what I was doing. If you like it, then more power to you. I don't even care if Mahjong is in every Yakuza game, but fucking goddammit, do not ever force me to play this shit ever again. Leaving behind that horrible, just trashy tile game, let's get into a returning side activity, but not from Yakuza 6, rather from Yakuza 0. I am of course talking about the second iteration of the Cabaret Club manager sim, Cabaret Club Grand Prix. And since this one didn't show up in the last video, I'll give you guys a little rundown on what it is essentially about. As the head of the 4 Shine Club, you're in charge of managing both the roster of hostesses you have at your disposal, as well as the operations that go during any given shift at the club, which consists of 3-minute sessions where the main objective is to rack as much cash as possible by pleasing customers that come in. As previously mentioned, the first and perhaps most important aspect to manage before an actual session is your roster of hostesses, who are divided into various ranks, ranking from bronze to platinum, with their effectiveness and stats dependent on the ranking which they are in. Obviously, at the beginning your roster will be quite small and composed of mostly just bronze tier hostesses, which are straight up garbage honestly, but thankfully you can increase your ranks by either recruiting some via completing certain sub-stories, advancing on the Grand Prix, or straight up gacha roles that cost more the more hostesses you recruit. Now, while a hostess of any other rank has her looks and stats pretty much set in stone, the Platinum hostesses are special because of two things. First, as I mentioned earlier, you can have special conversations with them which will boost their experience through the roof, and you can also dress them up and raise some of their stats as well. Added to the fact that the Platinum hostesses have the highest stats overall, makes them perfect candidates for when you want to rake in cash. But sadly, you can't use them every single time because of one of the mechanics in this minigame. You see, every time you finish a session, your hostesses will get tired and as a result, their stats will get reduced. And if you keep using them too much, they'll eventually be unavailable for work. So you gotta be conscious of when and how much you use not only your platinums, but every useful hostess in your roster. Next, after you're done managing your roster, it's time to actually advance in the titular Cabaret Club GP, and you can do it in two ways. The first one is the ranking match, which will help you define your current place on the different leagues that you can participate in. And if you manage to surpass the first place of the league, you get to challenge the league champion. The core gameplay goes basically like this. You can have up to 8 hostesses for any given shift, that you can divide onto the 6 different tables that are at your disposal. As the shift progresses, more and more clients will come to the club and you have to assign a hostess to them depending on their respective likes and needs. As such, you have to balance your picks in such a way that you have to take into account almost every single type of client that can potentially come out. Also, as you're getting more cash from your clients, a meter on the upper left corner of the screen will fill up, which is your fever meter, and it gets divided into 3 levels. Once you get at least to the first level, you can activate fever mode, which will take some of your customers into a state that will make them spend more cash faster. And that of course means more profits. But not everything is easy at the beginning of a league, because even if you have the club open, doesn't mean people will automatically fill every single table on opening night. For that to happen, you have to build up your fan base by successfully completing shifts, giving gifts to your customers, or partnering with businesses, which will boost your number of fans quite a bit. And so when the dust is settled and your shift is done, it's time to cash out your profits and see if you actually managed to rank above the top clubs on your current league. The thing is, despite the fact that there is a display on how much money you've gained over the course of the session, that's not the real result you get at the end. Another thing that happens when your hostesses level up aside from their stats rising is that their salaries also go up. And of course that means you'll get less money overall, so it is encouraged that you constantly rotate your hostesses. Or you can do it like me and just ignore it and keep grinding until the costs are offset by the sheer amount of cash you get. Championship matches, which are the second type of mode you can play, are basically the same as regular ranking matches, but with the added challenge of having to outdo an opponent in terms of cash, and they also have their own fever bar which they can use. But instead of making more cash for them, it makes some of your clientele leave the place immediately, which is a minor setback, but nothing more really. All in all, I did enjoy my time with the Cabaret Club GP. The gameplay can get quite frenetic at times, but not too overwhelming in my opinion. Sure, there were no major changes from what it was in Yakuza 0, but it's still quite enjoyable to play for hours on end, if nothing else. But, speaking of something enjoyable that did change compared to its original version, let's talk about the returning New Japan Pro Wrestling Dating Simulator, Clan Creator version 2. Unlike the version in Yakuza 6, Clan Creator has become an entirely different beast, with a new style of gameplay, but still retaining some of the ideas from the old version. And to be perfectly honest, I prefer this new style much more, simply because it went from a match of StarCraft where you rushed single hallways into a more strategy-focused tower defense game. As such, you don't end up spamming the X button to bring units into the field. In fact, you now only have a limited number of units to place, and if they run out of HP, they are gone for the rest of the level, so you better keep that in check. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let me talk you about some of the aspects of this minigame. First, kinda like Cabaret Club GP, you have a roster of special units that are ranked from bronze to gold, and of course their rank determines how effective they are. So, as with that minigame, the fastest you can get gold units, the better. And thankfully, these ones don't tire out, so as soon as you fill up your roster, you can keep it forever and however you like it. Now, unlike Cabaret Club GP or even the original clan creator, your units won't level up automatically. Instead, you gain a form of currency that you can spend to level up the stats of your workers after each battle, which in turn will raise their attack and HP, which will let them take on tougher challenges. But I also feel this makes the game a little bit more grindy, but again, that's just me. So, with your units set and leveled up, you're ready to take on the challenge of protecting your construction equipment from the various thugs your enemies throw at you. But how exactly do you do that? Well, at the beginning of a fight, the game lets you freely set up your units so that you can prepare for the incoming attack. And after you're ready, you can start the battle and see if your units are actually well prepared and placed to take on any incoming enemies. Now, in battle, the thing you'll be doing most of the time is watching your units hold off the waves of incoming thugs, which thankfully come one at a time, kinda like in Plants vs Zombies or most other tower defense games. For the units you have at your disposal, they are divided into 5 types. Attacker, which have low health but dish out the most pain. Defense, which are bulkier and pretty good to defend positions. Balanced, which is what it says on the tin. Gunners, which can attack at a distance. Grenadiers, which can clear crowds, and rocket launcher units, which are the superior range unit because they combine range with crowd control at the cost of speed, but their power more than makes up for it. As your units lay the smackdown on any incoming fool who even dares walk into your range, you'll get cash, which you can use to fuel certain special abilities and other helpful bonuses that can turn the tide of battle if you're in a pinch. The first of these being rising the spirit level of them by spending cash and pressing the triangle button. Rising their spirit levels will increase your unit's max HP for the battle as well as filling it up, which is pretty useful for when it is about to die. Now the thing is, you can only rise spirit up to 5 times and each time the cost gets higher and higher, with the cost to rise to level 5 becoming about 20,000 credits. You can also use your cash to use special abilities tied to the first 4 units in your formation, which are assigned to the 4 D-pad directions. These abilities range from crowd control to healing and even some nice support abilities. I personally had a setup with 3 attacks and an attack buff, but honestly, depending on your playstyle, you can use whatever suits you the most. So, continuing on how the flow of battle goes down, after a couple of waves pass, a stronger type of enemy will appear alongside the regular ones, the boss units. These ones are of course way stronger and have more life, so your priority should be taking them down as fast as possible. After you finish clearing the trash, provided they didn't destroy all of your equipment, you'll be done with the battle, and get a couple of tokens depending on how well you performed, how much durability is left on your equipment, and the remaining units on the field, which again you can use to beef up your units. And that's pretty much the core gameplay in a nutshell. The difficulty comes from battles becoming longer and longer and having more boss rounds as well, and I would say it does a pretty good job at keeping things balanced. Sure, you have to do some grinding, but I didn't mind it as much, and this is one of those minigames where I could just throw down my own music in the background and relax while playing, which to me is always a good thing. Clan Creator 2 is honestly a way more fun version of the original. There was never a boring moment for me while playing, and learning every single map was fun in itself. Also, the fact that I can do all of this storyline in one sitting was a pretty neat change as well. Now more than ever, I hope we actually get a Clan Creator spin-off with this type of gameplay. It would definitely stand on its own feet as a separate game in my opinion.
いい戦いぶりだったぞ。
And with the minigames out of the way, let's get into what you'll be doing for most of your playing time for this game, which is actual combat and exploration. Although, to be honest, this game inherited most of the systems from Yakuza 6 while doing some minor tweaks, so really I won't talk about it for much longer. First, let's get this out of the way. Are we seriously still using the same stupid targeting system? Like, for real? Of all the things that I don't quite like from combat in this game, the targeting is the worst and I always disliked it, and Ryuga Gotoku Studio just refuses to change it. With so many better targeting options out there, I wish they would just change it, and I will keep complaining until they do, but I get the feeling that this is never going to happen. I just hope that at least if they keep it this way, they make it a little bit more responsive. Please. But in any event, in terms of character progression, again, this is basically the same system as Yakuza 6. You gain experience by doing a multitude of activities through the game, such as minigames, combat, sub-stories, story progression, eating, etc. As you accumulate experience, you can either increase your main stats or you can buy special abilities, although I would recommend you upgrade your stats first before abilities. Although at certain points you will also have to buy an unlock for the next tier of stat increases. Now, while you have most of your moveset available to unlock from the get-go, there are some abilities that are locked behind sub-story progression, as well as items known as primers, which will teach you the ability in question so that you can buy them later. It felt a little bit forced for me, especially some of the moves like the Komaki Tiger Drop, which requires you to defeat a pretty strong boss on the Colosseum and then go back to Sotenbori to buy the ability to unlock it with experience. Like, I get it, Tiger Drop is one of the most busted moves in the series, and as soon as you get it, bosses will just melt away with the press of a button. But I felt that was one too many hurdles to jump through to get it. But other than that, I'm pretty okay with the progression system, I suppose. On the inventory side of things, I like the fact that now all healing items have the same amount of inventory limit. To be more specific, now you can stack up to 10 of every healing energy drink in the game, which is a fix to something I wasn't so hot on the previous game. And also, getting the high tier items is now way more easier. Add to that the fact that food items also retain their usefulness as well makes it so that you can have a pretty good option for getting both healing and some experience on the go, which I found useful on a couple of occasions, so bonus points for addressing one of the complaints I had last time. Finally, let's wrap up the gameplay section with the combat, shall we? First and foremost, since I don't think I went over the controllers last time, I'm going to give you a little explanation on what they do and their overall feeling during combat. First, you have your attack buttons, square and triangle, with square serving as the light attack and triangle the strong one. But now, as an addition included in Kiwami 2, you can also leave those same buttons pressed to unleash charged version of those attacks, which are pretty useful for breaking guards or even just dealing vast amount of damage. Next is the circle button, which serves as your grapple. While you have an enemy on a grappled state, you can press your other attack buttons to deliver some damage to him. But if you press circle again, you can also take them for a spin and you can even hit other opponents while you do it, making for a pretty good crowd control option. You can also get an ability that lets you throw grapples at the end of combos, which I find is a pretty consistent way to deal damage to a single opponent and then clear the clutter of enemies that surrounds you. The main bulk of your combos then basically consist of interchanging your light and strong attacks depending on the situation, while throwing circles into the mix for a little bit of crowd control. Sadly, if you got into this franchise from Yakuza 0, then you are going to miss the variety of styles as well as the ability to switch to them on the fly. Well, I understand that having more options is fun. The thing is, in that game I ended up just defaulting to one style until I got the dragon style and never looked back. Mainly because Kiryu's base styles all feel like crippled versions of the Komaki martial arts he changes to down the road. But when fists don't cut it, you can also use weapons that you can either buy or grab from the floor and then just lay into everything that stands on your path, which I feel is the element that gives a little bit of variety to the combat alongside the insane amount of hit actions in this game, as well as how fast the hit gauge fills up, which now that I bring it up is also another change that I enjoyed for this game. Gone are the confusing orbs that represented your hit in Yakuza 6, and now we have a more traditional bar that represents how many hit actions you have available, or how long until you activate extreme hit mode, or as I like to call it, Dragon Trigger, because let's face it, it's just the Devil Trigger from Devil May Cry. And speaking of that, I feel extreme hit mode was kinda nerfed this time around. I mean, you can still do some ridiculous stuff like Ultimate Essence or Infinite Knees that do insane damage, but it feels like the duration is shorter and there aren't many things that you can do with it. But maybe that's just me, to be honest. Now, all of this might as well be invalidated the moment you get the Komaki Tiger drop, as I mentioned before, but it is still a fun combat system to engage in for the majority of the game, and that's just your offensive options. In terms of defensive options, you mainly have 2 during combat, 3 with upgrades. First, mapped to your X button, is your quick step, which at the beginning starts short and not very effective, but with upgrades it becomes more reliable. Although because of how targeting works and how the other defensive options are this time around, I feel it is not as effective as it used to be. It has its uses, but like with targeting, it really only shines on one-on-one fights, and even then sometimes it also feels clunky. Not as awful as the targeting, but it's kinda up there. Now, what's the real deal in terms of defensive options is your block button, which is mapped to L1. Blocking, for both you and your opponent, stop attacks dead on their tracks, and while that may sound as a momentum killer, once you learn to get around your opponent's guard with a well-played strong attack, it is not as bad. In fact, I feel it actually encourages some degree of strategy over how you time your attacks and how you put up your blocks. But I can also see why most people who got used to the absorb guard style of the older games would not like this one, since it does slow things quite a bit. Finally, for your last defensive option that you need to unlock, there is the Komaki Parry, which you can do by pressing R1 and triangle at the right time, pushing your opponent to the side and leaving them free for you to wail down on like there's no tomorrow. And with this special upgrade that increases the time window in which you can parry, you can theoretically parry them to death. As for Majima's chapter, I really don't have that much to say. Most of the combat mechanics I mentioned for Kiryu apply to him as well, but because this is a shorter side story, you really don't get to upgrade him, and his moveset is confined to a stripped down version of his ultimate style from Zero. In this section of the game, the gameplay is just there for the sake of it, I feel, because the story is what's really important. And while not a bad thing per se, if you wanted more of him, you might end up getting disappointed because of how short the time you get to play as him is. So, to wrap it up, how does the overall gameplay stack? Well, I'm kind of in the middle of the road on this one. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to play and I enjoyed it as always, but the fact that this is basically just Yakuza 6 with some minor tweaks makes it a little bit disappointing, especially for the final adventure of Kiryu in the West. But regardless, Yakuza Kiwami 2 is still pretty good. Controls are pretty tight even if I had some problems with it, and there is room for improvements for future entries into the series, which is always a good thing. So do check it out and give it a try. I can guarantee you'll enjoy it. So there you have it, the final entry into the saga of the Dragon of Dojima in the West, and all I can say is that I feel kinda conflicted. On one side, I like the story in this game, and I could certainly see it as a stopping point for Kiryu, even knowing his legend was really just about to start. But on the other, I got the emotional closure I needed for this chapter in the series from Yakuza 6 The Song of Life, and the grand finale of that game is a really great send-off for those fans who had been there for a very long time, which is a category I fall on. I also feel kinda iffy on the fact that this game feels like a pastiche of Yakuza 6 and 0, while also being a remake of Yakuza 2. Although I'm still glad that this series is successful enough not only to warrant remakes, but also for the studio that creates them to receive a proper name, which I feel is a sign that it is no longer on the verge of disappearing on this side of the world like it was back during the Yakuza 5 days. Regardless, the fact of the matter is that the Dragon of Dojima is gone and we are now looking into a brand new future. Not only with Ichiban Kasuga's debut as the protagonist in Shin Ryuga Gotoku, but also the newest project announced by Ryuga Gotoku Studio, Project Judge, an entirely separate story still set in Kamurocho, but with a distinctive cast of characters, and believe me when I say I'm all down for it for sure. As for Kazuma Kiryu, all I can really say is thanks for the memories, and hopefully we'll catch you later. The future for the Yakuza series might be bright and shiny, but we gotta look at the present, because there is one last stop before the proverbial season finale for this channel, and it is another Ryuga Gotoku Studio game to boot, although we trade the shiny streets of a metropolitan Tokyo for a post-apocalyptic wasteland in which every step is a battle for survival. I am of course talking about the first Yakuza spin-off to hit the West after the fiasco that was Yakuza Dead Souls, the match made in heaven, Fist of the North Star, Lost Paradise. But that is a video for another day. For now, just keep doing the stuff you do and be nice. I am Hazard Kujaker, and I'll catch you later.